Welcome to Program 3 of Public Speaking for Lawyers. This program is called What to Do with Your Hands. And at the end of this program, you will be able to
understand how thinking, speaking, and gesturing are so completely connected.
You'll be able to confidently use the 3 prototypical gestures that everyone uses: give, chop, and show.
And you'll understand how to suit your actions to your words and your words to the actions of your gestures. That's how they work. To answer the question, what do you do with your hands? Why not use this as the simple instruction? Just gesture naturally. Just gesture naturally. Well, here's the problem with that instruction. Isn't this a set of opposites in human behavior? When we are natural, we're not self-conscious. And when we're self-conscious, we are not natural. So to say to someone, just gesture naturally, is to suggest that they do what they are not conscious of. And that's the truth about gesturing. Most of us have no idea that we are doing it. In fact, I have this experience all the time. I say to every audience of attorneys to whom I speak, everyone in this room, and I mean everyone in this room, gestures naturally in conversation. Having made that bold statement, someone inevitably approaches me after my presentation and says, and more importantly, does this. I gotta tell you, man, you said everybody gestures? I never gesture. And they prove my point as they think they are making theirs. How can someone say to me, I never gesture, and gesture as they say that? Well, that's how natural it is, how unself-conscious we are with our gestures. So to begin to answer for yourself this question of what do you do with your hands, you need to ask yourself that question sitting at your desk, talking to a colleague out in the hall, sitting in your living room or your kitchen table. What do you do with your hands when you are natural? And do you know? Because if you don't, of course, you can't be natural if you don't know what it is, particularly when it comes to this whole issue of what we do with our hands as speakers. And asking yourself these questions about your own gestures are essential. First of all, first question, how often as you talk do your hands leap into action as you are thinking and speaking? And I'm not saying you do it like me or anyone else, but I am saying you are instinctively the world's expert at how you gesture, but you probably don't know what that is. So how often do your hands leap into action? When they do, how big is that zone of gesturing? And as you are gesturing, how long do those patterns of gesturing stay alive? You need to know the answer to that question of how you gesture naturally in order to do it under pressure. Now, of course, there are some people who do it more and some people who do it less. I'm not suggesting we all do it the same, but everybody gestures. So here's a dilemma. So many people have been taught, especially so many lawyers have been taught by someone, often in law school, that gesturing is inappropriate. They shouldn't do it. In fact, they've been told that gesturing is distracting, so they should stand with their arms at their sides, or they should leave their hands on the lectern or the podium. Well, let's look at that behavior briefly. Let me stand in this position with my arms at my sides, and you answer the question, does this guy look natural doing this? And the answer is no. Isn't this what people in the military do when they are at attention? And isn't that fundamentally not natural? So, many people have been told not to gesture, and here's my argument why you absolutely must. Here is where history and science come together. Let's go all the way back to ancient Rome. Cicero, the great advocate of ancient Rome. If you look at his writings, you understand that he completely understood how connected thinking and speaking and gesturing happened to be. Let's go back even earlier to ancient Greece. Simonides, one of the people who wrote about oratory in ancient Greece, he understood completely that the way we think, the way we talk, and the way we gesture is completely linked together. So the ancients understood this thousands of years ago. And why suddenly people are told not to do it is one of life's great mysteries. Let's jump from the ancients to the Elizabethans, Shakespeare. Shakespeare perfectly summed up what we do with our hands when we are natural. In fact, in the play Hamlet, there is a speech that Hamlet makes to a group of actors about how to perform. and how to perform and be natural. And it applies not just to actors, but of course the role of an actor is appear to be natural as that character. So Shakespeare calls that, if you want to hold the mirror up to nature, how do you do it? And he summed it up this way. Here's what you do with your hands. Suit the action to the word and the word to the action. That's what we do when we're natural. We suit the action of our hands gesturing to the words that we're saying. And the words that we're saying are completely connected to the gestures of our hands. So that's what Shakespeare had to say. But now let's jump forward to the modern era and neuroscience. All sorts of people are researching gesturing, not just from a neuroscience perspective of what's going on in our heads, but a social science perspective of what's the impact on the gestures between the speaker and the listener. And here's what the people, the experts, if you will, about gestures say. Number one, it's natural. Everybody does it. Everybody gestures. That's a scientific fact. Number two, the flow of gestures actually helps us talk. The flow of gestures helps us fetch the words that we're looking for. If you lock up your hands, you lock up your brain. So it's natural, and it helps us talk, and it helps the listeners comprehend. That's why it is so critically important. So you've got to ask yourself the question, what do I do with my hands when I'm being natural, to come to that? And then come to the amazing reality that how do hands and the flow of hands actually assist the fluency of words as you're talking and thinking? And finally, they help your listeners understand. In fact, I'll share with you one piece of interesting information about the impact of gestures on listeners. You can't just say to someone, how did those gestures impact you? Because your average person says, I don't know, I'm not even sure he was gesturing. So you now need to look. And when you look, you will discover that gestures are matched to the words that we say. One of the places that researches gesturing, the University of Chicago, plays with gesture mismatches to test the impact on the listener. Here's an example of a gesture mismatch. I tell you a story and will test you aloud on what you learned. And in that story, at one point I say about the protagonist in the story, and then he slid down a pipe and ran across the street. That's the utterance. Now the match gesture, suiting the action to the word, would of course be, and then he slid down the pipe and ran across the street. But to mess with the heads of the listeners and to see what they remember, let me mismatch the gesture. Look at my hands. And then he slid down a pipe and ran across the street. Look at that again. He slid down a pipe and ran across the street. Well, you test the listener on what happened at that moment, and what do they say? They don't say, they say, he ran down the steps, he tumbled down the steps, because you saw what I was talking about. You saw what I meant. The visual of the gesture actually overrode the words that I was saying. So, your first assignment when it comes to gesturing is to take your own eyes out into the world and look. What do you do with your own hands? What has been happening right below your own nose that you've never seen? You've got to start to see it. But it's easier to look at other people. So you need to watch other people talk and look at their hands. Watch television with the sound turned off and just look at hands. Because we need to come to terms with what the ancients figured out about the importance of gesturing while thinking and speaking. And Shakespeare understood it, and modern science reinforces it. You need to know what to do with your hands, and we're going to show you specifically what those behaviors are.
Earlier, we said that we wanted you to look and feel natural, and therefore use your own body to feel like yourself. We also just learned that everybody gestures, but everybody gestures in a slightly different way. What can you do right now to start to understand what your gestures look like? It's true that there are some prototypical gestures that everybody uses. The world over, in every culture, we tend to see principal types of gestures that look familiar to us everywhere. For lawyers who have to discuss very complicated things, there are three types of gestures that we see all the time. We call those three types of gestures the give gesture, the chop gesture, and then the show gesture. So let's take them one at a time. The next time you stand to speak, even if it's, say, this afternoon or tomorrow, you'll be able to stand up and use give, chop, and show right away. You already do that. Now we're going to try and recognize them in ourselves as we gesture. So let's just talk about the first one. The first one we call give. And it literally is simply, I'm going to give you information, I'm going to ask you a question, I'm going to tell you about myself, and my hand is going to go like this. It's going to come right in front of me and say, good morning, my name is Marcia Hunter. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about gestures. So I'm going to use the give gesture, which is really just opening up. It's a kind of friendliness, and it shows the audience that you are giving them some information. That's why we call it give. It looks like giving. If I had a pencil in my hand, or if I were giving you a piece of paper, I would bring it forward towards you and give it to you. So giving does a couple of things, especially if you use it at the outset. It opens you up, and that mitigates adrenaline's effects. If we stay really small, adrenaline keeps looping because our body language is saying to our brains, everything's not okay, I'm going to stay small and kind of protect myself. But if we open up right away and give information, even if it's just your name, it opens up your body, and that mitigates adrenaline's effects. That sends messages that say, hey, everything is okay. This is a room full of friendly people. I don't have to be afraid. Now, if you have a slightly different personality, you might open up to say, go ahead, hit me. But giving this gesture of coming forward opens you up immediately. We want you to stand up, align yourself, stand still, and open up very immediately, the very first moment that you talk, almost on the breath that you take, and say the first words. It might be your theme. What are the first 3 things you should do when you file a patent? You've given the topic to your listeners, and now you're on your way. So give. This gesture will get you launched every single time. Do that with me right now. Say your name. Good morning, my name is, say your name. Just take a look at your hand. It's nice and open. The fingers are not locked. You're in a very open way giving information. The second prototypical gesture that we all use, and you'll start to see it now when you watch television with the sound off or watch gestures across a crowded restaurant, is we chop. Our hands go sideways and we chop for emphasis. I am not going to that restaurant again. The food was lousy. Or, you should have seen the snowfall this morning. It was so beautiful. We chop for emphasis. We chop to show that we are emphasizing a certain word. Usually, our bodies engage in giving or chopping completely instinctively, and we never notice. It just happens as the language flows out of it. But when you're trying to intentionally open up and gesture, these gestures can help you get your hands in the mix with the language, and then you'll start to speak more fluently. Everyone who speaks fluently gestures, either a lot or a little, but they use the prototypical give, and chop is a big part of what we're doing. For example, I could say, the first meeting was in June, the second meeting was in August, they placed the first order right in September, and then they met again in January. I've chopped my way across a timeline that helps my listener understand how time unfolded in this story, and it shows the marker events along the way. I've just used the chop. The last prototypical gesture we call show. Show takes many different forms, and we all do it all the time without thinking. We can show abstract ideas. For example, we can say, I'd really like to go to the party tonight, but I've got a lot of work to do. We've just shown that on the one hand, this is what I'd like to do, but I'm not going to go because I have a lot of work to do. It looks a lot like give, but here, because it's actively weighing options, it's starting to show us how we feel about a certain topic. Here's a really interesting example of the show gesture I just heard from a lawyer who was speaking at a publishing conference. Here's what he said. If you're thinking of signing that contract, you better think first. If you sign it, you could be giving away the rights to your ebooks. Let's examine what he did. First, he showed us the contract. Now, it was abstract, but suddenly his body said, hey, let's show that piece of paper. We knew that was the contract. And then he was signing it. He pantomimed signing a contract. Now, if I said to you, go ahead and pantomime signing a contract, you would say, are you crazy? That sounds contrived. I would never do that. It isn't real. And yet this lawyer had no idea he had pantomimed anything. Here's what else he did. He actually pointed to his brain to say, think about it. Again, if I said to you, go ahead and point to your brain, that'll really let people know you're talking about thinking, we would say, that's too cartoonish. And yet we show these examples all the time. The last thing he did was that he showed us an e-reader in his hand. He actually showed that if you signed this contract, you'd lose those rights. It's almost a pantomime, but it's so vivid and so completely natural. He did it all without thinking. His body found the gestures that went with the point he was trying to make. That's what we all do all the time, is we show how gestures help us tell a story, and we show the story with our hands. So right away, as you stand to speak, give some information. If you feel stuck or if you feel like you're not gesturing, chop a few of your important points. And then when your hands are free and they're really flowing with the language, they'll probably show some really interesting things that you're not even aware of. That's what to do with your hands.
So the good news is you already know how to gesture. You have an instinct for it. You have an unconscious use of it all the time. You just have to trust it. So what we need to do as speakers is be ready to gesture. So you need what we call the ready position. In other words, where do you put your hands before you begin to speak so that they're ready? Let's start with the positions that don't work. If you stand up with your hands down here, you're not ready to gesture. If you put your hands back here, you're not ready to gesture. If you put your hands in your pockets, you're not ready to gesture. We would call all of those positions resting. I'm resting in line at the airport. I'm waiting for the elevator. I'm resting as I'm waiting for that ATM. But you're not ready to gesture. You need to be ready. What is that? Well, let's go back to what is natural. Let's look what we do with our hands while sitting down when we're totally relaxed and at ease. So if I'm sitting down, look where my hands are now, where your hands might be listening to me. If we technically examine this position, we could say, well, let's see, his elbows are bent and his hands are loosely touching in his lap. And from there, when he's talking and gesturing, gosh, I'd love to go to the party, but I'm just too busy. We gesture in a way we could describe as this area here in front of us, so we need to be in that area. So here's how to gesture while standing up. I'm going to stand up, leaving my hands and my arms in exactly this position. Watch this. That's the ready position. I'm going to sit down again. Elbows bent, hands loosely touching. I stand up, and suddenly I'm ready to gesture. So let's look at some other things that don't work. Don't stand up as the speaker and interlace your fingers as if in prayer. This is not about leading morning devotions in a religious service. This is about, as Marcia just said, being ready to give some information or chop some information. So you want to be in this ready position with hands loosely touching. Look at all the options. Fingertips could touch, palm on palm, palm on the other palm, loosely holding these fingers with the thumb and fingers of the other hand. In other words, you want to be ready to gesture. Frankly, it's a little closer to this, the throw me the ball, I'm ready to play, but it's the more formal version of that. Don't hold a pen. If you do, you will click it and twirl it and fondle it and distract your listeners with it. But if you need something to hold on to, here's what we've come to call the secret handshake. And the secret handshake is this. Here, try this at home. Put one palm forward with the thumb out to the side, and then loosely, with the other hand, loosely take that thumb, hold it, a little bit like you're holding a bicycle handlebar, and then gently pull it towards you, but not too tight. So you're not doing that. So you've got something to hold on to, that lifelong security blanket that we've been sucking on since childhood. You're holding it gently. From there, you can gesture freely. It gives you something to hold on to that you cannot click or twirl or make noise with, but it's something to hold on to, and from there, it's so easy to gesture. So that's the ready position. If you stand up, plant those feet, take that breath, and as you're focusing your eyes, say, get the hands up to that ready position, your instinct to gesture will kick in, and you will know naturally what to do with your hands.
Now that you've found a ready position that's comfortable, hands loosely touching somewhere in the middle of your body, notice that when you open your hands, they tend to open onto an area that's right in front of you here. When you give information, when you chop, showing different dates in a timeline, we tend to gesture right here. That can also serve as an imaginary shelf upon which you can put ideas and things. You can talk about the dates that you met. The first time we met was in June. That was a very long meeting. We signed the contracts in June, and then we decided that we'd meet again in August. In August we met. See that it's come along the shelf? Here's June, July we didn't talk about, August is here, and now we can talk about what happened in August. At the August meeting, we went over all the financials, and then we were prepared to take the next step, which was in September. And notice that I'm still on the shelf here. The shelf is a wonderful secret for public speaking, because I, as the speaker, can put things on it that will help me remember what I want to talk about. Earlier, I spoke about breathing, and I said that if you got control of your breathing, you would get 3 benefits. You would feel better, you would speak better, and ultimately, you'd think better. I remember that because I put them on the shelf. Once I've put things on the shelf, I have a powerful kinesthetic mnemonic that helps me come back to the same topics and speak about them even out of order. If I have spent 5 minutes of practice saying I'm going to put this on the shelf and this on the shelf, and then January's going to be over here, when I come back to speak about them, my hands, those smart friends who are helping me speak well, my hands actually know where each thing is located on the shelf. So I can talk about the June meeting and contrast it with the one in January when we made the purchase. The shelf is always there. It refreshes itself every time you bring your hands back to the ready position. It helps listeners because you're organizing things. And if you go from your right, it's their left, and that's how speakers of English read. If you start at the right, you're bringing people through a process, giving them a list, and it makes perfect sense to the listener. It helps them keep things in mind. But for you, it's a powerful way to remember what you want to say. And the magic part is, it's always there. You never have to write anything down because you know the main points. They are on the shelf. Put them there with gesture.
So you need to be aware of one more thing regarding gestures, and it has to do with the size of gestures, or what we call the zone of gesture. Understanding adrenaline makes you understand that the body is using adrenaline to make a decision about protecting itself. Should I run away? Should I stand and fight? So it's natural for opening gestures to be very small. In other words, the zone of gesture is right here in front of me because my body is responding to a perceived threat and my gestures aren't going to be very big. So there's the action. A fellow who's nervous gestures in a very small zone. Someone who gestures in a bigger zone looks so much more comfortable. Just think about the words tight. Man, I was tight. Or, oh, I was loose. Well, this zone of gesture is a big space. The shelf that Marcia was just describing is 4 or 5 feet, depending on the length of your arms. If you want to look and feel comfortable, you've got to fill up the whole zone. Here's what nervous speakers do. They stand up, even if they've gotten themselves to some kind of ready position. Their initial gestures are just from the wrist. And then maybe after a minute or two, they gesture from the elbow. But the upper arm is still tight against the body, and eventually, several minutes in, they begin to gesture from the shoulder. Well, one of my mentors used to say, if you want to look comfortable, you've got to have some air in the armpits. And that's what nervous people do not do. Their upper arms are tight against their rib cage. It's very much that protective position of I'm protecting myself. And so you need to understand that not only do you need to be ready to gesture, the reason we're putting things on the shelf, as Marcia just described them, is because that will allow you to open up and fill up the whole zone. And think about what presence really means. Presence has to do with, on some simple level, how much space do you take up? Boy, that woman has presence. Well, it's not a mystical quality, it's a physical action. Think about if I keep talking to you, but I take up the smallest amount of space, I become obviously a very different person when I tighten up this much than if I loosen up this much. So, think about this as I put it on the shelf. First of all, you need to be ready. And you need to be ready by putting your hands in that ready position on the shelf. And once you're ready and on the shelf, you need to occupy the entire zone. And if you do that, your gestures will help you offload that adrenaline to look and feel even more comfortable. So in this program, here's what you've learned, and here's what you want to say to yourself as you do these actions. First of all, raise your hands to the ready position and gesture immediately. Say and do that.
Jumpstart your gestures by putting a word or a phrase on the shelf.
Your gestures will look and feel more natural if they're slow and smooth. Say that.
Use the give gesture to give away some of your nervousness and appear more comfortable and confident.
Now, practice these gestures. Notice them in your everyday life. Notice how other people use them. And then you will know what to do with your hands.